All right. Hi, my name is Patrick. I'm a co-founder and former CEO of Rotten Tomatoes, and today I'm going to be talking about focus. This talk is targeting first-time entrepreneurs, early-stage startups, and folks thinking about starting a startup. But I think it is useful for everyone to hear. My story began earlier this year. I was volunteering as an entrepreneur in residence at Blue Startups, a tech accelerator in Hawaii. There, I worked with 7 different startups daily over the course of 2 months. And the advice I gave each of them over and over again was that they were all trying to do too much, that they needed to focus. Over the course of hammering that point in over those 2 months, I realized that I had not followed my own advice, that I had not been focused with my last few startups. I've always known focus was important. It's a lesson I learned early in my startup career. But somehow, I had forgotten that lesson, or maybe I chose to ignore it. I look back at my experience with my own startups. I started 6 companies, of which Rotten Tomatoes was the 3rd. The companies where I was focused worked. The companies where I was not failed. Then I looked around and saw that every successful company I could think of started off focused. And that's when I realized that focus is the most important thing for a startup to have. Ironically, almost everyone gets this wrong. And it's probably the #1 reason why so few startups make it. But why do so many entrepreneurs make this mistake? Entrepreneurs believe they can do anything, and so they want to do everything. It's actually harder and against their nature to focus. Too many features, too many categories, too many markets. They want to be everything for everybody. You can spot the worst offenders a mile away by looking at their pitch deck. They have a competitive landscape slide. On one axis, they have their company and all their competitors. On the other axis, they have a list of features. For each competitor, they have a few features checked off. For their company, they have a line all the way across. I'm sure a bunch of you have this exact slide in your deck right now. These entrepreneurs are building everything but the kitchen sink. This is the most common problem entrepreneurs face by far. If I had to take a guess, I'd say that 99% of all entrepreneurs have this problem. They are not focused. So what is focus? Focus is answering one question as quickly and cheaply as possible. Do people want this? The goal is to get to product market fit, which I define to be when a product is so good, people tell other people about it without being asked to. Think Game of Thrones or Stranger Things. In other words, the product sells itself. I like to think of finding product market fit as trying to start a fire. Imagine your resources, your time, money, and manpower as a flame. Early stage, your startup is a match. A gust of wind could blow you out. Now imagine your big idea for your company as a log. Your goal is to light that log. If you've ever been camping, you'll know that you cannot light a log with a match. The match will blow out before the log catches fire. So what do? You start with kindling. You light the kindling, then go to small sticks, then medium sticks, then large sticks, and then light the log. And one important thing to remember about fire, it spreads. If you really nail it, you could end up with a forest fire. That's Facebook, Amazon, Google. Their fires are so big, you couldn't put it out even if you wanted to. So how do you find product market fit? You reduce scope. Cut away until it's one feature, one category, one market. This is the opposite of building everything but the kitchen sink. For feature, pick a feature that is the main reason why people would use your product. For Rotten Tomatoes, that's the tomato meter. You could cut away everything else, the cast, crew, filmography, photos, etc., and it still 95% works. For Twitter, that's the tweet. On the category side, choose the category that makes the most sense for your business based on fit, expertise, interest, connections, monetization, etc. On the market side, go for the lowest hanging fruit. The smaller and more niche the market in the beginning, the better. At the start, entrepreneurs generally have extremely limited resources. So reducing the scope of the problem increases the chance of success. Not only does it allow you to do things faster and cheaper, it ends up being a better product too. One way to tell if you've cut enough is to see if you can explain your product in 15 seconds. If it takes you 5 minutes to explain, it's too complicated. Ideally, you should be able to explain it to someone and they can explain it right back. For example, Rotten Tomatoes is a site for movie reviews and news. We gather all the reviews from professional critics in one place, and then we give you a score based on the percentage of critics that recommend seeing the movie. A product that you can explain to someone else will spread. A product that you cannot won't. Let's look at 2 examples from the startups that I've done. We'll start with Rotten Tomatoes. So for feature, as I mentioned before, that's the tomato meter. Our market was movies, and our category was movies, and our initial market was hardcore movie buffs. With Rotten Tomatoes, we saw early signs of product market fit when, 1, the site was featured on Netscape and Yahoo. 2, a famous film critic, Roger Ebert, wrote an article for a magazine highlighting his favorite movie sites, and Rotten Tomatoes was one of them. And 3, when Pixar released A Bug's Life, we saw a spike in traffic, and it was coming from Pixar. And this was all within the first year of launch. And because of these early signs, we went out, raised money for Rotten Tomatoes to turn it into a real company. Before Rotten Tomatoes, I had a design firm called Design Reactor. At first, we provided web design, 3D design, and print design for any type of client. We were super unfocused. However, we quickly realized that 3D just took way too long to render, especially back then. This is in the mid-90s. And print took too long to get the color proofs. So we focused down to just web design. After we landed a contract with Disney Channel, we focused our market down to just entertainment. Once we were web design for the entertainment industry, everything fell into place. Our portfolio made sense, we were able to charge much more, and we never had to cold call again. And the money we raised from Rotten Tomatoes, it came from the clients we had from our design firm. The best products and best companies do primarily one thing at the start. Think Rotten Tomatoes, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter. You literally can't be more of a single thing than Twitter. It's a status update. Amazon started with just books. They went public just selling books. It wasn't until year 2 or 3 of being public that they added a second category. eBay started with just Beanie Babies. Facebook was just Harvard. Google was just simple search. When Google started, Yahoo was huge. In other words, Yahoo was a portal. In other words, they were everything but the kitchen sink. Yahoo had unlimited resources. Google was a pair of PhD students out of Stanford. Yet Yahoo was beaten by Google at the one thing that Yahoo was supposed to be good at, search. But even Google, with Google Video, with all the resources of Google behind it, couldn't beat YouTube. And instead, Google was forced to buy YouTube. Same with Facebook buying Instagram, and Amazon buying Zappos. In every case, the larger company with infinitely more resources could not compete with a smaller, focused startup. Going back to that competitive landscape slide I mentioned earlier, instead of having a line of checks all the way across for features, you should have one check for a single feature and do that one thing better than anyone else. That was Google for search, YouTube for video, Instagram for photo sharing, Zappos for shoes, Rotten Tomatoes for movie reviews. Now that you've found some kindling, how do you go about lighting it? You have to launch. Do what you can with the resources that you have. Otherwise, you'll get stuck. Without money, you're stuck trying to fundraise. Without tech people, you're stuck trying to hire an engineer or find a technical co-founder. Rotten Tomatoes went from idea to launch in 2 weeks by one person, our creative director at Design Reactor, Sen Duong. Sen was not a coder, so he built the website using static HTML. Twitter was born out of a hackathon and built in 1 month with a minimal team. Facebook was built by one person, Mark Zuckerberg, in a few weeks. And FaceMash, an early prototype of Facebook, was built in 1 night. To launch quickly, you should release a minimum viable product. A minimum viable product is a product with enough features to validate a product idea early in the development cycle. This is equivalent of drawing blueprints before building a house. It's a lot easier to move a room around when it's blueprints than after you've built the house. There are a number of approaches to putting out a minimum viable product. I'll go over a few. Customer interviews. You can actually validate a product idea just by talking to customers you think are the most likely to use your product. Kickstarter. What's great about Kickstarter isn't just that you can raise money from the platform, it's that you can validate your product idea before actually building the product. Landing page. Landing pages function very similarly to Kickstarter. Make a landing page for your idea, buy Facebook ads, and see if people sign up to get notified when your product launches. And finally, doing it manually. Craigslist and AngelList have list in their names because they started as mailing lists. Craigslist listed stuff people had to sell, and you replied if you're interested in buying it. AngelList highlighted startups and who was investing in them, and you replied if you were interested in investing in that startup. It wasn't until they became very popular that they spent the resources to build a platform. And anyone could figure out how to launch a mailing list in 1 day for 0 cost. If you're trying to launch your product, you could potentially launch with just email, mailing lists, and Google Sheets. For example, if you're launching a game, you could use dice, tokens, cards, pen and paper to test and improve the game before ever writing a line of code. Reduce scope and launch a minimum viable product quickly. Iterate. When you launch, you're trying to light your kindling on fire, i.e., you're trying to find product market fit for a tiny market. Think of what Facebook did at Harvard before launching into a second school. Within 24 hours of launching, they had 1,200 students signed up. Within a month, over half of the university was registered on the site. If your kindling won't light, then pivot. Change the feature, or the category, or the market, or even try something completely different. Things don't always light on the first try. Rotten Tomatoes was my 3rd company. Mark Zuckerberg did multiple startups before Facebook. Max Levchin did multiple startup projects before PayPal. YouTube originally tried to be hot or not with video. Justin TV pivoted to Twitch. Odeo pivoted to Twitter. Does focus always work? No. Being focused doesn't guarantee success, but being unfocused guarantees failure. Look at Juicero, which raised $120 million to over-engineer a product that no one wanted. Or HomeJoy, which raised 40 million and prematurely scaled before finding a model that worked. Or even the recent drama around WeWork. What was the first thing they did when they tried to clean up their act? They cut all their non-core businesses. In other words, they focused. But these examples are all companies that got big enough to be noticed. The majority of unfocused startups you'll never hear of. They struggle in silence, which leads me to my next point. Stress. Stress goes hand in hand with entrepreneurship. It's natural when it's your own thing. You will put in 110% and care more about it than almost anything. You carry the weight of protecting your employees, investors, clients, users, your company's brand, your reputation. The 3 startups I did after Rotten Tomatoes all failed. Combined, I spent 15 years of my life and almost 7 million in funding. Looking back, my success with Rotten Tomatoes made me try to go straight to light the log with a match. And predictably, all 3 times, I was unable to start the fire. The stress I endured during that time led to mental, emotional, and even physical problems. I was suffering from insomnia, shortness of breath, I had to have an inhaler, full body rashes, hyperthyroidism, all due to stress. I've had friends that started losing patches of their hair. We saw Elon Musk nearly having a complete breakdown on Twitter. There have been startup founders that have committed suicide, all due to stress. Stress is one of the main reasons why founders start fighting and taking their startups down with them. And why am I talking about stress during a talk about focus? Because the good news is that being focused reduces stress. For example, if I told you that you had a calculus test in a week, that everything depended on it, you'd stress out about it. If instead I told you that you had an addition test, you wouldn't blink twice. A huge source of stress is being unfocused and biting off more than you can chew. In fact, I'd say that this is a leading cause of stress in startups. You get stuck, and everything is harder, takes longer, and costs more money. Reducing scope and focusing makes things easier, faster, and cheaper, which leads to less stress and better mental, physical, and emotional health. I'll end with a quote from Steve Jobs. People think focus means saying yes to the thing you've got to focus on. But that's not what it means at all. It means saying no to the 100 other good ideas that there are. You have to pick carefully. Don't say yes to 100 things and end up trying to light a log with a match. Stay focused and start with kindling instead. Now get out there and start some fires. Thank you.